Welcome to Forward Fest. We are so glad you are here engaging with some of the bold ideas and forward thinking that make Princeton the special place that it is. We want to hear from you throughout a year of forward thinking, and particularly during Forward Fest. Be sure to tag any of your forward thinking posts on social media with hashtag Princeton Forward. That includes any questions or comments you want to share with the Princetonians who will be part of our broadcast today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of our Data Science and Artificial Intelligence session, Brad Smith, Princeton class of 1981. As president of Microsoft, Brad leads initiatives across the technological enterprise, balancing a technologist's optimism with a critical eye towards cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence. We look forward to hearing the discussion he will lead with three of Princeton's forward thinkers today. Take it away, Brad.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Forward Fest, and welcome to this particular session in Forward Fest. This evening, it's all about data science and artificial intelligence. I'm delighted to be the moderator this evening and to be joined by three people you'll have the chance to meet. I'll have the chance to talk with three terrific members of the Princeton faculty. You'll meet Matthew Salganik. Matthew is a professor of sociology, and he's the director of CITP, the Center for Information Technology Policy. You'll also meet Mona Singh. Mona is a professor of computer science, and she's also a professor at the Lewis Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics. And finally, you will meet, as with me, Elad, a professor of computer science and the director of the Princeton Google AI Lab. But first up, I want to introduce you to Matthew. I'll chat a little bit with him, and then I'll chat a little bit with each of the other two, and then we'll bring all three together. So Matt, why don't we start with the simple question, what is CITP, and how did a professor of sociology end up as the director of it?
Sure. Thanks, Brad. CITP is the Center for Information Technology Policy. We're a center that's part of both the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and also the School of Public and International Affairs. And at CITP, we work to understand and improve the relationship between technology and society. And we take both of those goals really seriously. So understanding this relationship, we do research that helps advance the state of the art. We publish academic papers. Also improve, we take that very seriously. We work a lot with policymakers to help them address many of the very important challenges that arise today as we think about how technology impacts society and how we can make that better and maybe have technology serve more of the goals of society.
When I was an undergraduate at Princeton, we heard a lot about data and we did a lot to study science, but those were not two words that were necessarily put together. For somebody like me who might have started out not being familiar with what data science was, how would you describe it to somebody who's not an expert in the field?
Sure, I think of data science as basically the science of learning from data. And so you might say, well, that's not really new. Like we've been learning from data for a long time. And that's true, but I think the way that we learn from data now is different. So I think data science includes elements of statistics, but then as the size of the data sets that we have access to now get larger and larger, we need to bring in many more ideas from computer science. And then finally, data science needs to include a third element, which is domain expertise. So if you want to learn about data in astronomy, it helps if you know something about astronomy. Likewise, if you want to learn about data from in biology, or likewise, if you're working with social data, it helps to have expertise in the social sciences to help make sure that you're learning correctly from the data that you have.
Now, I think that actually is a great description, as I understand it, of your own background. You come to this world from the field of sociology. You've really become a pioneer in the use of digital technology for social research. What drew you to this intersection?
Well, to me, this is the most exciting time to be a sociologist because we can do things now that we could never do before. So in my dissertation, we were able to traditionally, social scientists study people in laboratory experiments. Maybe some people on the call when they were in Psychology 101 at Princeton, they were in some of those lab experiments. But now, for example, we can take those and do those online. So we built a website where people could come and download new music, but then we could control the information that they had about what other people were doing. And so we could study social fads in a very new way. So we were able to have an experiment that's 100 times the size of what you could do previously. And that allowed us not just to do the same thing that people had done before 100 times, but it allowed us to do something qualitatively different. And so I'm really excited about how we can take advantage of the tools and infrastructure of the digital age to do this new kind of social science.
And you've been putting this to work in some very important areas. One of the things that I think is really interesting about your work is what's called the Fragile Family Study. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure. This was a scientific mass collaboration that I organized with a number of people at Princeton, including Sarah McClanahan, another sociology professor, as well as two graduate students, Alex Kindle and Ian Lundberg. And what we were interested in is measuring the predictability of life outcomes. So given some information about a child and given some information about their environment, like their parents or their neighborhood, how well can we predict what will happen to that child or that family? And this is really important for scientific reasons, because this is really an important measure of society. That is, if we can predict everything about what will happen to a kid based on information we know at their birth, that tells us something important about that society. Likewise, it's very important for policy reasons, because increasingly now we're seeing governments and businesses trying to use predictive models about people's behavior to help make high stakes decisions. And so it's very important to understand how accurate those models might be. And so what we did is we set up a mass collaboration. So we were really inspired by Wikipedia. So Wikipedia creates this amazing encyclopedia. And one of the neatest things about Wikipedia is that it didn't require any new knowledge. All of the knowledge that was needed to create Wikipedia already existed, but what was needed was a new form of collaboration. And so Wikipedia, they were able to use digital techniques to create new forms of collaboration. And so that should make us wonder what other big scientific problems we can tackle with new forms of digital collaboration. And so we set up this mass collaboration with hundreds of social scientists and data scientists trying to predict the life outcomes for kids from this amazing data set that's been collected by Sarah and her colleagues over the last 20 years.
And what have you concluded?
Sure. What we found is that actually, despite having hundreds of people using state-of-the-art machine learning and data science methods and a very high-quality data set, none of the predictions are very accurate. So I think it raises really important questions about the limitations of predictability in social domains. And also, likewise, it raises important scientific questions about what else is going on out there that maybe is not being currently captured in our data and our models.
One of the things that I think is interesting about your work is, as I understand it, it involved as many as 40 members of the Princeton community as co-authors of one of your studies. Can you say a little bit about that and how did that work?
Sure. I think this is one of the most exciting things about data science, is that it's kind of a glue that brings people together. It creates a shared set of techniques, a shared framework that allows people from all over campus to get excited and work together. And so our paper, which was published a few months ago, it had 40 Princetonians as co-authors, including undergraduates, graduate students, faculty from across the social sciences and engineering. And to me, that's a great example of what data science can enable.
Increasingly, I think that is what we're seeing across the Princeton campus, and it's certainly a big focus of what you're doing at CITP. As you think about where you're trying to take CITP into the future, tell us a little bit about your vision for how it will connect with the different departments across Princeton.
Sure. I think the intersection of technology and society, it's one that if we perspectives, so computer scientists and engineers, it can't just be social scientists, and it can't just be humanists. It really needs to be all of these people working together. And so I found some of the most exciting things that we've done at CITP have drawn on the expertise that exists all across the campus, bringing together, again, we had a series that I think a particularly good example of this is we had some workshops about AI and ethics, and we brought in people who faced real AI ethics dilemmas. And then They had the experience, they presented those dilemmas, and then they were discussed by an interdisciplinary audience. And it was just fascinating. The exact same problem, the way a social scientist thinks about it is really different than the way a computer scientist thinks about it, is really different than the way a philosopher thinks about it. And none of those ways is better. And actually the best outcome is when we are able to combine those approaches.
Yeah, now I actually feel like you're describing part of my job. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Of course, one of the things that you've really done with CITP is focus not just on bringing people together across the Princeton campus, but as you said, working at this intersection between technology and society and breaking new ground for the public's understanding of these issues. What are you learning as you take the data, come to conclusions, and as you said, reach some conclusions that might surprise people? How do you walk them through the methodology and gain their confidence in this use of data science?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So one of the things I've been really surprised by is how open people are to our help. So when we talk to government officials, elected officials in New Jersey, or lawyers and technologists at the Federal Trade Commission, they're often incredibly excited to hear what we have to say because they are facing such difficult challenges. And a lot of these governmental organizations do not have all the resources they need and all the expertise they need. So I've been really pleasantly surprised at how much I think CITP has to contribute to the world and how receptive these people are, and also how fast the problems are changing. So even the things that we were thinking about a year ago, there's new things to think about now. And then, ideally though, we don't want to be chasing just what everyone is thinking about now. We want to be out ahead, thinking about the problems that are 2 to 5 years in the future. So one thing I like to say, back when we could go to the office, if you walked around the halls of CITP, there are posters from our events. And I would say, if you see it on the wall at CITP, you're going to see it in the New York Times in about 2 years.
Well, I think that connects actually with the last question I wanted to put to you at this point. Let's go 5 years into the future. What will CITP doing that's different from today? What will this whole field of data science look like in 5 years that's different from the way it looks today?
Sure. I think at CITP, we'll see a lot more engagement with the world, a lot more. We try to think of what are the things that we can do that uniquely contribute to this important ecosystem. So I think more helping more people and doing more research. So getting out there more. And then in terms of data science, I think it's really exciting. To be honest, I don't know. And that's what makes this such an exciting thing to me, that, right now we are laying the foundation, and what will come out of that, we don't know. So I think about that a lot when I think about Sarah McClanahan, my colleague, who started this Fragile Family Study 20 years ago. And she has been, there's been so much effort to collect this important data. And when she started that, she had no idea how it would be used 20 years from now. And I think right now we're laying that foundation for things that will happen in the future that we can't even imagine. And that's really exciting to me.
No, that's great. I think that gives us a nice foundation for the rest of the conversation this evening. So Matt, don't go anywhere. We'll come back to you and we'll get all of us together. But in the meantime, thank you. And let's transition over, and I'll bring Mona Singh into the conversation.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
We are doing experiments in Kenya and some other places, trying to ask what animals are doing in their natural settings and how this might be changing over time, potentially due to human activity. And in order to interpret what they do, we decided very quickly that we need to understand where their body parts were in space and time, and in such a way that you can compare populations, compare individuals statistically.
We use deep learning or artificial intelligence to track and predict the precise pose of an animal.
At the core of our technology are artificial neural networks. And these are mathematical constructs that we train to be able to convert images into predictions of where body parts are located.
And the precise way in which we put these networks together is sort of a novel configuration to let us not only track an individual animal, but to also track multiple animals. This is really critical for my research. We focus on how animals interact with each other in order to navigate through the world. And so not only as a neuroscientist is it exciting to figure out how the brain works by understanding the behaviors that a brain can generate, but it's really powerful for predicting how drugs or genetic mutations affect behavior.
Well, Mona, thank you for joining us. Yeah, we've been talking about how data and science have come together in this new field of data science. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the work that you do is it also involves two words that people didn't used to put together: computational biology. Tell us what computational biology is.
Sure. So in the last few decades, biology has been transformed by all these high throughput technologies. And so now biologists can measure lots and lots of things in a single experiment. Or, they've determined the genomes of hundreds of thousands of organisms. They've determined when genes are on. They've determined, what types of molecules are interacting with each other in the cells. There's just a lot of data. And even though we have all this data, without using computation, you can't make sense of this data. So computational biology arose because biology slowly has become transformed into an information science. And so computation is like a key component of biology now.
And of course, it's driven by the use of machine learning and algorithms. Another set of words that we hear in the news, we read about it all the time. Can you help us understand a little bit about how you put machine learning and algorithms to work with all of this data you're describing?
Sure. I mean, I think the main goal of computational biology, just very broadly speaking, is that you would like to develop methods that can extract knowledge from this data. You'd like to be able to discern patterns that aren't necessarily obvious. So we use machine learning methods to try to, for example, predict various types of things of biological interest. For example, which mutations you observe that are damaging, or which proteins in a cell interact with each other. And in many cases, we have gold standard sets or data sets where we know what the right answer is, and we can learn from examples. And in other cases, it's completely unstructured data, and we try to discover things. For example, looking for patterns that occur more often than you would expect by chance alone.
And Princeton has been really at the frontier of molecular biology for a long time. But with computational biology, I think you're really pushing forward on the frontiers of knowledge. Are there some particular areas where you're the most excited about what you're learning or what you're creating in terms of new understanding?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm really excited right now about, we're in an era now where doing genome sequencing is really inexpensive, and we have genomes for many individuals now. And so you and I, our genomes aren't identical, they're a little bit different. And we ourselves, we can see are very different. And so trying to develop methods that can figure out the role of this variation and trying to explain like both kind of natural differences in the healthy context, but also even maybe more exciting, trying to develop methods that can figure out the impact of mutations in disease. So I'm really excited about the work that we're trying to do, for example, to discover which mutations are relevant for cancer initiation or progression, which mutations could maybe be targeted if you want to try to treat someone's cancer.
And I know that you sometimes say that your lab is a method development group. Mm-hmm. When you put that in the context of computational biology, what does that mean?
It means we're developing novel methods as necessary to make sense of this data. So the data now is so vast that you can't just use simple methods to extract, and so heterogeneous. You can't just write some simple scripts or use kind of off-the-shelf methods and make sense of this data. You really need to develop the right tools to extract knowledge from them. And so we're focused on developing the appropriate methods to decipher biological data sets.
And as you're doing all of this work in the middle of a pandemic, at one level, it, I think, makes it even more relevant to the problems that concern the world. And then on the other hand, I'm sure it's harder to bring people together than in many other times. How are you managing this work in your lab amidst COVID-19?
So I have to say, I feel very fortunate there, and probably most of us in data science do. We can work at home. My group and I interact via Zoom, just like we're interacting now. So I feel like we're unlike the experimentalists. The power of computer science continues. And our work can continue. We're just super lucky in that way.
So as you keep moving forward, you referred a little bit to cancer and the like. Let's look a decade ahead. I only asked Matt to look 5 years ahead, but for you, let's look a decade ahead. What are some of the practical problems that you think you and your team have a chance to help the world solve?
Me and my team. Okay, so I think I'd like to think that we could develop methods that can really pinpoint which mutations are relevant for particular diseases of interest, and that these could be used by people who develop drugs to help find new drug targets and develop drugs that target those diseases. And so I think that's something that we could do in the next 5 to 10 years. And I would be very happy if that's something that turned out to be the case.
And if you think about just the field of computational biology more broadly, how do you think that has the potential to reshape all kinds of things in not just say this decade, but in the decades to come?
Well, I think, a lot of computational biology, of course, is beyond the medical realm, but I think that's perhaps the most exciting and appealing. Biology and the things that we can measure is just, it's just changing so fast. And it's easy to imagine a day when we walk into a doctor's office, we have our genome that's already sequenced. Maybe we have other kind of molecular data that's been collected on us. We have clinical data, and this can be used in a clinical setting to decide how our problems should be treated. And I think that's an amazing thing to think about. I think we're seeing little glimpses of it already today, but I think that's really going to be the major difference in 10 years. And I think computation will be a key player in getting us to that place.
And as this field changes so quickly, I mean, one of the things that I think is so interesting is if you think about, say, Princeton alumni that may be watching this, and it might have been somebody who graduated with a degree in biology 10, 20, 30, or like me, 40 years ago. How do we best keep pace with what is just such a rapidly changing field?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, just keeping up with the news is just being informed is extremely important. And I think one way in which biology has really changed is the connections that it's making with all these other fields. And so it's really important also to keep up with what's going on in data science, but also chemistry, physics, and many other fields that have really helped advance things in biology.
And how does that even impact, say, the work that goes on at the Princeton campus, for the faculty, for students who are studying in these fields? Obviously, it sounds like it's a lot more multidisciplinary than it was in the past. Just when you think about what it takes to create a more multidisciplinary culture at Princeton, what kinds of steps are you all taking to foster that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, I'm part of the Lewis Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics. And that's this great multidisciplinary institute where we're all working on problems in molecular biology and focused on decoding the genome. And we're a group of faculty that come from, computer science and chemical engineering and molecular biology and chemistry and physics. And as part of our teaching mission, of course, we're also training the next generation of scientists to have this multidisciplinary training. And it starts with our integrated sciences program, but it also continues into graduate education as well.
I think that's maybe a great point to hit the pause button, because I will come back and build on all of this multidisciplinary interaction. But let's go to the next video, and then I'll spend a few minutes with Elad, and then come back and talk some more, Mona. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
The Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton, or CDH, is an interdisciplinary research center and academic unit located on the B floor of Firestone Library. The CDH consists of developers, designers, scholars, writers, and teachers, all working in the field of digital humanities. What is digital humanities? In one sense, digital humanities involves applying computational methods to humanistic questions, things like digital archives, text mining, mapping, or network analysis. But digital humanities also involves bringing humanistic insights to bear on how we use technology in scholarly research and in daily life to help make our data-driven world more equitable and just. Let's hear more about the mission of the CDH from Faculty Director Meredith Martin, whose research as an English professor collecting data about historical poetics planted the seeds for the center's establishment.
Digital humanities at Princeton has always been about fostering interdisciplinary communities. From our roots as a small group meeting in the special dining room of Maddie College in 2011 to the founding of our vibrant, internationally recognized research center in 2014. Since then, we have secured our reputation for best practices in technical research and design and excellence in technical research and design. And we've extended our reach through our many, many workshops, panels, guest lectures, symposia, and reading groups. At the CDH, we are especially dedicated to supporting initiatives related to social justice and the public humanities. From shedding new light on African American cultural heritage, through annual Douglas Day Transcribe-a-thons, to co-sponsoring Professor Ruha Benjamin's Just Data Lab, which investigates data practices as part of the movement for Black lives. In all of the work we do at the CDH, we create connections across diverse groups on campus and beyond. We raise awareness of the cultural nuance of data science, and we foster creativity and innovation at the intersection of humanities and technology. The CDH welcomes scholars from all parts of the university at all levels. Whether you're a faculty member, a research software engineer, a subject librarian, or a student, we look forward to working with you soon.
Well, welcome back, and Elad, it's great to have you join us. Elad, I want you to know I have worked at Microsoft 27 years, and this is a first. This is the first time I get to interview somebody about the work they are doing with Google. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. We're going to talk a little bit about the work that you're leading for the Princeton Google AI Lab. First, tell us what it is. Describe a little bit about the work that's going on.
Okay, thank you for having me, and thank the audience, the alumni, for listening in. The lab we have here in Palmer Square, it's a relatively new lab. By the way, it's also a first to me to be asked about the lab. I've been a professor all my life, and this is kind of a side job that I have right now. So I founded and direct this lab. This lab is focused on foundations of machine learning, foundations of AI. And we have a team of very diverse team of a few visiting faculty, postdocs, students, undergrads. And the goal is to expose them and do innovative research in methods and foundations of machine learning. So I'll be happy to tell you a little bit about the projects. I don't know if you want to ask me about them specifically or...
Why don't we do that? I'd love to hear, I know others would. Tell us about some of the projects that you think are really exciting.
Okay, good. I'm happy I get to ask my own questions. So historically, my background is in optimization, mathematical optimization for machine learning. And one of the algorithms that we co-developed is used in Google and also in Microsoft in optimizing deep neural networks. So historically, this is kind of the direction that I came to the area, and my team in Google has been doing optimization. Optimization means faster training of deep neural networks, which means making these machines learn faster from data and come up with results that are better and faster. We have another very interesting set of projects that has to do with AI for social good. So one of the most recent projects we're very excited about is improving methods in machine learning for medical ventilation. And this is, of course, very important right now with COVID, but ventilators are important anyways. And the goal is to design methods that can control the amount of air input to a patient, to a ventilator, sedated patient and help them breathe in kind of a more efficient way, in a better way than existing ventilators. So we're using AI, measuring people's lungs, simulation of lungs, simulation of ventilators and airways and so forth, in order to try to learn from the data methods, how much pressure to apply and when to apply it. I think that's another exciting project we're doing right now.
I think for a lot of people watching, they go, that's great, I get it. But they might wonder, but why do that between a university and a company? As you've had a chance to spend some time working in this space at this intersection and a real partnership, if you will, what do you see as the benefits of this type of collaboration for, say, Princeton on the one hand and for Google on the other?
The primary benefit is to science itself. So what happens is the scale of problems we encounter today is so large that it's just infeasible to conduct experiments on computers or equipment that we have, that any single, even university has. So we have to use the cloud, and the cloud, such as these big corporations have, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth. I was just giving a talk. So this last year, a language model came about called GPT-3 from OpenAI. It's a laboratory in California. I think actually Microsoft is licensing this technology for natural language processing. And this model is so large, it contains 175 billion parameters, and it was trained on 500 billion words. So this is more than 500 people here in their lifetime. Huge amount of basically all the text you see on the internet. And being able to analyze this data and experience the data and optimize over it and train deep neural networks is just, in terms of resources, compute resources and monetary resources, is beyond what a typical lab in university can afford. So my area of research, which is optimization, which is to train these deep neural networks fast, we can only see some phenomena when we go to this scale that is only available in these kind of large scale operations. So I would make the analogy to a microscope. Like if you have the microscope in a lab, and it used to be that only a few people had access to the best and most powerful microscope or best and most powerful telescope. It is similar in that respect today to the compute resources and data resources that scientists like me need. And the hope is that we can expose students and researchers to these resources to benefit science, benefit the university, and of course benefit the corporation also, because the corporation gets access to researchers who can advance state-of-the-art in that field of large-scale optimization, large-scale data science.
You obviously see this in the work that you're doing with Google. I see it from another vantage point because, as you may know, you probably do, Microsoft is working with Bonnie Bassler and Ed Wingren in the molecular biology field in a similar way, bringing computational power and just this enormous data capability to issues like biofilms and the like. One of the things that I think is always interesting to think about when, say, universities and companies work together is how to protect one of what I think is just one of the fundamental tenets at Princeton, academic freedom. And I think for people who are not as familiar with this, they might worry, is academic freedom at risk? As you guide this kind of work, how do you protect that principle?
This is a great question, and indeed it is a tricky situation. So our particular arrangement with Google, the lab that they built here, basically all of the intellectual property belongs to Princeton. So this is something pretty amazing that I don't think many, it's pretty rare situation. So in effect, there is no, everything we develop here goes to the open source. This means code that is open source and available to everyone in the scientific community worldwide. This means all the papers we publish here are available to any of the other researchers worldwide. So that is, of course, a crucial aspect of it. We do not develop any proprietary technology here that is used for one particular corporation. And this is very important. The other is, of course, the involvement of students and allowing them to pursue their projects in a way that that is completely free to them to explore whatever scientific discipline they want to have. And we do have, so Eric Schmidt, who is an alumni of the university, he was very influential in founding this lab, and he himself said as a student, he had to drive, I don't know, maybe it's an hour and a half north to Summit, to where AT&T Bell Labs used to be. So this kind of situation used to, when he was a student, I guess, that was the main hub of scientific technological innovation, to have access to the machines they have over there to explore the science, computer science of that day. And he wanted to have something accessible to our students right now that is closer to the campus and more accessible. And I think that's the goal, and we're trying to fulfill it by kind of allowing undergrads and graduate students to do state-of-the-art science here in this lab.
As we think about just the position of research in the United States today, I mean, obviously the federal government's support for basic research is just probably the strongest pillar there could possibly be for basic research writ large. But we're also living in a time when basic research funding at the federal level has fallen. We're living at a time when more and more industries really are being driven by these advances in science and data and engineering. Do you think we're going to see more of these kinds of partnerships in the future of Princeton and the other research universities in the US?
Right. So I think science itself has changed in the past decades because of technology. So university is a way of mankind to have some kind of risk. Here, have some few smart people, we give them tenure, they can do whatever they want, they don't have to worry about their livelihood, and they're free to explore whatever they want. And maybe 99 out of 100 times, nothing substantial maybe, or nothing super innovative comes out, but it suffices that a few very risk-taking professors invent something radically new, and it's worth to society at large. But what we have in the recent decades is I think an economic inventions of startups. That's another way to mitigate risk. So we have innovators that found these little companies, and they're able to do state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art research. And we have corporations that have research laboratories that are on this. This maybe is older than, but the scale of on which this is happening is different. So Microsoft Research, I think, has maybe 1,000 researchers, and Google has another 2,000 researchers. And altogether, we're talking about a scale which is several dozens of universities of researchers working full time in these laboratories. So I think it's much more diverse situation right now, and I do think we'll see more of these collaborations going forward between corporations, universities, and startups.
And I think maybe that is one last question I'd like to build on and put to you, because if these types of partnerships are going to expand, I've certainly run into universities myself that I would argue are not quite as focused on protecting academic freedom as I think Princeton quite rightly is. And I've also encountered companies that I think come to these partnerships with less appreciation than, say, Google and Microsoft, I believe, have in terms of the importance of academic freedom. If this becomes a broader phenomenon across the country, what is your thinking? I mean, what should we all be talking about and doing to sort of nurture a principle that I think has been just fundamental to the research that has taken place at Princeton for a number of decades now?
Right. So in some sense, grants from industry is not a new invention. So this has been something that I remember as a student. My professors and those before them would get financial incentives from corporations to perform certain types of research. We have now larger collaborations between universities and the industry, which I think is very positive. But it is extremely important that faculty have the opportunity not to have any kind of contact with academia at all, do their own research, which is completely independent. And I think Princeton is very adamant about it, and I think other universities understand it very well, that this kind of principle of freedom to research whatever the researcher is interested in. So I think this will be key. This has been going on much longer than any corporation we're talking about. So Princeton has been around for 350 years, and I think it's a successful model. So as long as we have the option of professors of doing their own research, which has nothing to do with industry, and it's funded by the U.S. government or funded by the university, I think that we're safe. I mean, as far as I can see, it only adds to the diversity of research being conducted and the resources available to the university researchers.
I think that's well put. Well, we're going to go to a video here, and then you'll stay with us, and we'll invite Matt and Mona, and we'll start a broader conversation. But thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Brett.
What we're finding is artificial intelligence is affecting our lives in very meaningful ways, just at an amazing trajectory and pace. You can imagine all of the ways that AI is just sort of proliferating in our lives. For example, autonomous cars run very sophisticated artificial intelligence, and they need to do these processes with high performance because you don't want to get them wrong, and they need to do them quickly. Now, the way that a lot of these applications are handled today is the data is sensed by some device and then sent to the cloud, where you can do artificial intelligence on heavy-duty computers. But that movement to the cloud poses a security concern, it poses a latency concern, and you may not even have connectivity. There's real technological bottlenecks that need to be solved. So that's driving us towards something called edge AI, where you're actually moving the artificial intelligence computations close to the source of the data. Essentially, what the architecture does is, in a computer chip, we have a lot of data that we need to crunch, and that's stored in memory. Instead of moving that data out of the memory to do the number crunching, this technology does that number crunching on that data right there in memory. And in doing that, it eliminates the costs of moving that data out of memory, the energy costs, the time costs, and so on. And so that's essentially at the heart of it, what this technology is trying to do. So being able to keep that computing locally really enables artificial intelligence to spread its wings in ways that it couldn't before.
Well, welcome back. Well, as you can see, this is the 2020 definition of being together. So it's great to be joined by all three of you at the same time. I think we've covered some terrific ground that has really highlighted the potential and the promise of data science, of computational biology, and computational thinking more generally. But let's talk a little bit first about some of the other side of this, and then we'll take in some of the questions that are coming in live from our audience. There's a lot that this can accomplish for the world, but let's talk first about the limits. What are the limits that each of you is encountering and say what computational thinking, what data science can deliver? Matt, I know this is something that you've been focused on, so let me start with you and then we'll all bring us together on it.
Sure. So I'm teaching a graduate seminar this semester with Arvind Narayanan, is a computer science professor also at CITP. And our course is all about the limits to prediction. So it's if given enough data and the right algorithms, does everything become predictable? And I think the answer is no. And so I think as scientists, we need to understand why that is. And then that knowledge can help us as we think about using these predictions in the world. And so I think there are limits to prediction. And then I also think it's important to think about the limits of prediction. So when predictions are used in a lot of social settings, often what they're trying to do is reproduce the patterns that already exist inside of data. So for example, people who are using risk scoring in decisions about bail, pretrial detention. So they can look at past patterns and then they can try to learn from those patterns. Now, the problem is that any data that comes from the world today, I think we should expect that data to be full of bias and unfairness. And so I think we need to be really careful that as we deploy these predictions in the world, we don't end up perpetuating the problems that exist in the world. And we keep in mind that we have the opportunity to actually change the world and make it different and make it better.
I would love to hold that comment on bias. So we'll come back to it. But before we do, Elad, Mona, any thoughts that you have on, say, the limits that you're encountering in what data science can deliver?
Sure. Anna, you want to go first, Mona?
Sure. I mean, I would say that one of the limits in kind of thinking about things from a biological sense is you'd like to be able to understand mechanisms as well. And so, data science, machine learning is really good at doing various types of predictions, but we don't always understand the reasons why these methods work. And so I think really in science, you also want to keep track of mechanisms. I want to hit a little bit also on what Matt talked about with respect to bias, which also comes up in computational biology and in particular in the health arena. So, you're extracting knowledge from the data sets you have, and maybe the data sets are coming from research hospitals, and maybe certain people have more access to research hospitals. And so you end up, there's a danger of really making existing opportunities or existing health disparities grow even more. And as a final kind of limitation, I mean, I'm mainly optimistic about what AI can do in biology, but I would say that the great things that have been going on in industry, they've made machine learning really easy for people to use. There are lots of packages that exist, anybody can use it. But actually one of the tough things in machine learning is how do you test the methods? Once you've trained something, how do you know whether you've actually created a good predictor? And the way in which you actually test, you actually need a lot of domain knowledge to do that. And when people first enter, they don't know, even if they know a lot about the domain, they don't know how that fits in with machine learning. And it's hard to make the same kind of general tools to help people think about testing. And so I think that's a danger that you see a lot in computational biology.
Now that's helpful. Elad, anything you want to add?
Yeah, this is actually my favorite topic. I could talk about it all day, but I'll just say something small. So it's related to what Mona said about understanding. What I see, if I think about intelligence and I try to understand what's missing from today's artificial intelligence, we're very good about learning from data, learning from examples. This is called inductive learning, but not so good in deduction, or maybe not at all good. So this means trying to have the computer learn to add numbers or multiply numbers, not from example. I don't teach my kids how to add numbers by giving them billions of examples, but I try to teach them a technique, and they can think for themselves maybe and improve that technique, maybe some of them. So that is something that we're missing. So this reasoning and kind of doing deduction, I think is something we're behind on.
Part of what I think is interesting, I'd love to get your sense of, is how you take something that you do that in each case is quite technical and is very detailed, and the details clearly matter enormously. And yet they have broad, important implications for the public. How do you bring the public along to understand both the potential and the limits? As I think even about the year 2020, it's been this extraordinary year. We had this conversation publicly in March about what this virus was. We've spent many months educating people to follow trends, almost like we would follow weather patterns. Now we're talking about the efficacy of a vaccine. We live in this world where this is just perhaps an example of many issues to come. How do you think we get better about taking these issues to the public at large?
I think one of the great things about being at a university is we get lots of practice teaching. I mean, this is an important part of our jobs, what we do. And so I just see communicating with the public as a different form of the teaching we do. Unfortunately, the public does not want to listen to a 50-minute lecture. So we're a little bit more constrained in the kinds of material we can convey. But so one thing I like to do is think about using these short conversations to help convey some of the ideas, and then encouraging people to go and read the actual research that we've produced.
I think if I can add to this, I agreed completely with Matt. Another thing that we do, and I think Mona does this a lot, is to have projects that the public sees the benefit of very clearly. So if we're working on improving medical ventilators, and we can say, look, this has been going to improve people's lifespan and maybe potentially save lives because we can improve how ventilators are constructed. And it's something that speaks to everyone. Everyone understands the benefit of it, and the public can connect to the importance of this research.
Yeah.
Mona, any thoughts?
I mean, I agree. Some of the stuff that we work on a broad range of problems, some of which are more basic science, some of which are more medical in spirit. And I think people can really grab on to things that affect their own health. And so working on the right applications is a way to reach out to people. I also wanted to add one more thing, which is that we, as faculty, we also get opportunities to teach young people, not just at the university, but also even doing outreach in the community. And that's a way to talk about complex ideas in simple ways and hopefully train young people to think about these issues critically.
I think this really takes us, squarely into, another set of words that we didn't put together a decade ago. Today we talk about the ethics of AI or responsible AI, and a set of ethical principles that I think quite rightly, not just in the United States, but people around the world are talking about. And one of them you've mentioned already is bias. Another one that is coming in, and one of the questions is the protection of privacy. You all work in these fields where you do your best work when you have enormously large data sets. And this is true really in every aspect of data today. How do we not just put data to work to, we hope, advance the human condition, but protect people's privacy along the way? In each of your areas of work, are you seeing certain good best practices emerge? Mona, let me start with you, because your work, I'll say, goes to the heart of what is often such a point of sensitivity: human beings, human biology, human health. How do you and your colleagues think about this?
Well, I would say full genome data is highly regulated unless you choose to make your genomic data available to anybody. You just put it on the internet. So when we do, for example, analysis of cancer genomics data, we go through a whole protocol applying for access to this data. We ensure that the computer is not accessible from the outside. So I do think that regulation is really important here. And so in the genomics field, at least, I think people are trying to have thought about these things pretty early on. As much research has shown, it's hard to really maintain things to be truly private. And I'm glad that we have colleagues at Princeton and elsewhere who think about those issues in the context of genomes and otherwise.
Matt, Elad?
Sure. So I guess I would give kind of two different answers. One is at the Center for Information Technology Policy. This is a core question. One of our main areas of research is privacy. And so we think about what are techniques that can be used to make data harder to re-identify. We also do important work in trying to expose privacy violations that are happening out in the world, developing new technology to do that. And so I think these are big questions. As far as in my own research as a computational social scientist, we have a strong set of ethical principles that govern our work that were crystallized in the 1970s in a document called the Belmont Report. So respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And so those principles are kind of widely shared among academic researchers. And I think it's a challenge to modernize those principles. They were written in an age where a lot of the same opportunities didn't exist. But I think that's something that's an active area of debate and discussion in our community. And it's something where I'm seeing people developing new techniques where in the past, often, it would be a goal to make a technique faster or cheaper. And now I think we're starting to see people developing methods where privacy and ethics are part of the goal of developing that method. So I think it's an area of active work, and it's one that computational social scientists take very seriously.
And a lot, obviously, Google, like Microsoft, like lots of tech companies, use really large data sets for commercial purposes. Yeah. How do you find the conversation about something like the protection of privacy in the context of a university industry partnership?
Yeah, to be honest, this is one of the conversations that is most commonly I hear about, and it's not even my field. So my field is to create methods, and the methods we create sometimes builds machine, and this machine can be used in a way that is maybe again not private, or could be misused in a way that is not creates bias and so forth. Now, as a methods person, what I think my responsibility is to acknowledge that this is indeed a dangerous, potentially dangerous machines, potentially dangerous methods. And when I teach courses in university, we devote usually a class to this. So we say, look, there is this, it's an important issue. We would like to invite someone maybe from CITP, Matt or one of his colleagues there that can give a guest lecture about privacy and bias and so forth. In Google itself, again, there are researchers, groups of a lot of researchers, larger than my own group, that devote themselves to the study of bias and privacy and ethics and so forth. huge groups, and they contain sociologists and professionals in areas that are different from my own. And we all realize how important their work is, and I think this is one of the areas that I think there is the most, a lot of emphasis about.
One of the issues in the world today around ethics and concerns about AI are reflected in another question that has come in. It's a big world, and today a lot of people in the United States and in Europe, for that matter, take a sometimes more skeptical or even concerning look at what's happening in China. We see things like the social credit score and the like. What do you all think of what's happening in, say, China or other parts of the world? Are you seeing some practices that cause you concern? Anybody who wants to go first?
I will just go ahead and say that China is outside of my area of expertise, and I'm not an expert in what's going on there, but I do think that you can imagine situations when you have a concentration of power and you have a concentration of data and measurement capabilities, that there are potential for bad things to happen. And so I think right now, I think many people have a sense that when they're online, all of their behavior is being tracked. I think many people know that when they go to Amazon or some other e-commerce site, that store is collecting all the clicks that you're making and all the things that you're doing. I think increasingly we're going to see this ubiquitous measurement happening in the physical world also. So this is the so-called Internet of Things. We're going to start to see sensors in the built environment. This does create, I think, very legitimate concerns that if we don't have the right safeguards in place, that all of this stuff could be used for things that aren't society's highest and best values. But I do think there's also a lot of exciting things that we can do with more information about people, and we can imagine making better policies and targeting our resources more effectively. But I do think it's a very valid concern.
Elad, Mona, any thoughts on this one?
I wouldn't necessarily single out China on this. I mean, I think there are a lot of problematic regimes in the world that are less democratic than our own, even though even our own system has all sorts of issues as of recent, and it's very hard to safeguard against potential information use, misuse of information. So I think this is more Matt's specialty than my own.
I do think it's right to broaden the question. I think it's an interesting way to think about this because there may be one way and only one way to add up numbers, and mathematics is a universal language. But when we're talking about these issues like ethics, we obviously have very different philosophical traditions around the world. And that can then manifest itself in different cultural values. And so as we're talking about these enormous data sets and all of the potential uses of this, I do think it raises a broad question. And I think people at universities can often be at the forefront. Any thoughts on how do we have a global conversation? Or as you put it, Elad, even in a country like the United States, which obviously has an enormous diversity of views on almost any topic under the sun, how do we build common ground for sort of a shared understanding on what should be the limits of how we allow data to be used?
I'd love to say something about it, if that's okay with my colleagues. So
yes, of course.
I mean, I'm an immigrant to this country, but I'm maybe the biggest patriot. I love what this country is doing in the way of bringing immigrants to universities and putting them together. And in my lab, there is not two people from the same type of background. They're each different, from a different country in the world, and this propagates. So these people, many of them return to be faculty in their own home country or have colleagues in their home countries. And the discussion here, the US is a leader in higher education and leader in technology. I don't know, I hope it will remain for the foreseeable future. And I think that it is doing a great job of bringing immigrants, qualified immigrants, to study here and for the higher education, such as Princeton, which is the best university in the world, if I can put that way. And then sending them home or sending them elsewhere with more knowledge and propagating this knowledge onwards to everywhere in the world.
So I would also add that although there's differences across the world, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think there are broad values that are shared. I think that within countries, there are also differences, and that's okay. So for example, the Swedish government collects an enormous amount of centralized information about the people of Sweden. And many Americans would find that very troubling. But in Sweden, they have transparency about how that's collected, and the government making those decisions has accountability. And so I think we can find the values that we all share, and we can push for transparency about what's happening, and then accountability for those who are exercising that power.
Mona, anything you want to interject here?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about, we've been talking about countries, but there's also the role of companies within single countries and, or even across countries, and what kind of data they have and what their goals are with respect to using their data, and how that might not be always in the best interest of society as at large, just because it's the best interest financially for a company. So I think the question that you're asking about, foreign governments and their motivations, some of them we can also say, are there conflicts between what's best for, Twitter, Facebook, and what's best for people at large?
No, I think that question is more than fair. And as you might imagine, it's one that I find myself being asked and often answering. I do think it takes us into another dimension of what is really quite an interesting and multifaceted, set of questions around ethics. And why don't we pick up, Mona, on what you just posed? I think researchers have learned that the social media companies today have enormously insightful and huge data sets. Mm-hmm. I was struck 2 years ago when some of the groundbreaking research that really identified Russia as the source of nation state attacks in a wide variety of contexts was actually put together by the US Senate Intelligence Committee based on using its subpoena power to get those data sets and then turn to researchers in New York and at Oxford University to go to work analyzing it. I think increasingly, in academic fields, people find themselves thinking about that balance. Do they want to have access to these data sets? How do they feel about the data sets that are being built up in large companies, whether it's in social media or otherwise? How do you all think about that, Matt? That's obviously an issue that's sort of right in the heart, in part, of what CITP exists to think about. What kind of conversations do you find take place among faculty members about this?
Absolutely. That's something we talk about a lot at CITP, and it's something that we think is a great opportunity. We've talked before about collaboration between industry and universities, and I think this kind of research collaboration that serves also a role of some kind of oversight and accountability is very important. And so I'm particularly excited about a project with an entity called Social Science One and the Social Science Research Council and Facebook, where they've set up a mechanism that researchers apply to an expert panel to get access to data that's gone through a de-identification process internally at Facebook. And then funders have agreed to fund that work so that the researchers are not being funded by the company, they're being funded by independent foundations. And then the researchers are able to publish the work without it being internally reviewed at the company. Because I do think there are many, many talented researchers at these companies, but there are also many, many questions that they are not able to ask. Because I think there are often incentives not to, let's not look under that rock, because we don't want to know what's under that rock, even if that's a really important thing for society. So I hope that we can come up with other kinds of mechanisms. And I think here, federal regulation could play a role. That is, if these companies want the opportunity to operate in society, that they should then be subject to some forms of transparency and accountability to researchers who can potentially make it clear what's happening. Because there's a lot of good can be done with the data that's sitting inside of those companies.
And Mona, you I think nicely framed this issue at the outset. What are your thoughts on how we should think about the answers to these questions?
I think it's a very difficult question. I agree with Matt that a lot of this will end up being taken, that we should think about it with respect to regulation. and what types of data can be collected, what types of data can be put together, how it can be put together, and what kind of data can be released. I mean, even in my own field, I don't, I can imagine that some of the data that large companies are collecting would be immensely useful to people in genomics. So for example, not everything is determined by your genes or your genome. Environmental factors play a huge role as well. And your Google searches are going to reveal things about your environment. So you can imagine that this data that's being collected could be useful for all kinds of fields. I just think that it has to be tightly regulated.
And if we think about some of the specifics, I think this is a really interesting time for us to sort of peel back a couple of layers on this onion. I mean, we live in a world where more than 110 countries have a national comprehensive privacy law, and the United States is not one of them. And yet I think there's a lot of folks who think that 2021 may be the year where that changes. There's a real bipartisan focus in the Senate to try to get a privacy law across the finish line. There's a couple of issues that the Europeans have been grappling with that I think really go to the heart of the work of data scientists. A lot of data scientists that I've met, I sometimes feel like they've never had too much data. More data is always better. But the European privacy regulation has really been founded in part on a principle that data can only be used for the original purpose for which it was collected. And yet, Mona, I think you in particular work in a field where 5 years from now, people might literally find they have part of the cure to cancer in a data set that is figuratively in their hands, but it wasn't collected for that precise purpose.
I think that's such an excellent point.
How do you strike that balance?
I think that's a great question. Like, I think that's really been the paradigm shift in biology and computational biology. Like in the early days, people just analyzed their data set, and everything they learned came from that one data set. And now the most exciting work that's being done is kind of bringing all these data sets together. So don't just interpret a single person's cancer genome by itself. Look to everything, so the methods we do, we try to think about all the different types of information that's been collected for, as you say, for other reasons. And so I don't have a solution for that, but certainly in my domain, it's really absolutely critical that we be able to integrate this type of information. For reasons other than for why they were collected.
Another sort of similar question that I'm just finding is of heightened sensitivity around the world, again, especially in Europe, is a real desire to ensure that, say, European data stays in Europe. In fact, there's sort of this growing political momentum around stopping it from moving across the Atlantic to the United States. And then even in the US, you just see every day a huge concern about data moving to, say, China. But in the fields in which you all work, really at the forefront so often of using data to solve important human problems, how do we strike that balance? Data will be treated differently in different countries. Is this the kind of thing that we should worry could get in the way of real advances in scientific research?
Yeah, I think it's something we should worry about. I think, as Mona said, there's great opportunity in combining different data sets. There's great opportunity in using data sets in ways that were different than where we were collected. But it's also true that there's great risks that come from this. And I think part of the reason the public feels concerned about a lot of these data flows is that what's happening is not very transparent, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of accountability for the people who are making these decisions. So I think to the extent that researchers and companies show good behavior and are able to act in ways that earn people's trust, I think we'll start seeing more of that trust. I think researchers actually are quite different than companies in that regard. The processes that Mona talked about, the processes that I go through as a social scientist, it's not the case that we can just do whatever we want. It's not, and I think that many people, rightly or wrongly, feel that, and I know within companies there's a lot of variation as well, but I think many people have a feeling that there's less oversight and control inside of companies in terms of how their data is collected and used.
Well, and Elad, I think that brings us back to you to an extent. We were talking before about the importance of transparency, and almost every delineation of the important ethical principles for AI and data always involve transparency. And yet, in my experience, if you want to put somebody on edge who works for a company, suggest that they need to publish their algorithm. And instead, I think people increasingly are focused on this notion of transparency in the sense of explainability. How do you find that topic arising, if at all, in say, the Princeton Google AI lab at this stage?
That's a great question. I think that there are two, I can give you two answers. First of all, I'm also a Princeton faculty, so my allegiance is to science, and I've made that very clear to everyone involved that, I have the ethics of trying to come up with discoveries, and I will publish my discoveries. Luckily, this is completely in line with what Google also has in mind for this particular lab, and I think more broadly. So the sentiment I'm hearing more inside of Google is, you have to publish your research because it's like a sanity check. Just like you publish your open source, now that many products are now commercial products are completely open source. And the reason for it is because it allows other developers to check and improve and correct your code. So in that sense, publishing your research has a similar effect. You want to know that you're in the correct track, and you want your community of peers to judge your work and give you feedback for it. So this is also, I sense, a very broad, not as broad as in academia, but pretty broad sense in all of Google research. And I think it's the same in many other research laboratories and companies. So it's beneficial to the companies to be open and be transparent and publish.
And I think I just want to add one thing about CITP. At CITP, we're very excited about building up mechanisms that are respectful of the data privacy, because, on the one hand, we want transparency, but on the other hand, we want the data to be protected. So we're working on trying to come up with mechanisms that protect potentially intellectual property, protect data privacy, but still allow for forms of oversight and transparency.
So we're down to our last question, and I'll just put it to a couple of you. But this conversation, I think all of you have done this fantastic job of just highlighting this extraordinary multidisciplinary world in which we live, and the extraordinary ramifications that come from the use of data, both good and perhaps not so good. Mona, first a question to you. What advice would you give a freshman who wants to major in computer science about what that student should learn in the humanities? Is the humanities still important to somebody who is going to be a computer scientist?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a strong believer in a broad liberal arts education. And, it's important to be aware of all the different issues that we've talked about. In a way, we've touched upon ethics, we've touched upon philosophy. These are things that any computer scientist should be able to think and reason about. And just one other thing from a selfish point of view, computer scientists also need to be able to communicate the type of work that they're doing, that's in writing and in speaking. And those are things that our humanities classes do an awesome job teaching.
Well, then Matt, I'll give you the last word. You come from the Department of Sociology. Let's say you meet a freshman who is determined to major in one of the humanities, didn't come to college with a love of math or statistics or computers. What advice would you give that student about what he or she should learn in the fields of computer and data science, if any?
Very similar to what Mona said, a broad liberal arts education that includes humanities, that includes social sciences, and that includes engineering and computer science. I think we've talked a lot about all the changes that are happening in the world today. A lot of these changes are being driven by ideas in computer science. And so to be active in the world, to think about, debate these questions that we're talking about, I think understanding things about computer science are going to be really key, as are understanding things about social sciences and the humanities. I think Elad talked about the long historical arc and hundreds of years that Princeton has been around. And I think the liberal arts education is an idea that's aged well. For hundreds of years, that's been a great idea. And I think that will likely be true for hundreds more years.
Well, let me just say in conclusion, thank you, Elad, Matt, Mona, great conversation. And I would just leave one last thought for all of us, because I think you just hit the nail on the head. It doesn't matter when we graduated or if we're a student of the future. It doesn't matter what field in which we studied. Two things are true. what we studied is actually of enormous relevance to a broader range of problems than ever. And we all have so much more to learn that we'll only learn by working with people in other fields. I think there's few places in the world that bring these disciplines and people together better than the campus of Princeton University. So thanks to all three of you. Thanks for all of you for joining us. As you can see, this really is about forward thinking. Good evening.
Thank you for joining us for Forward Fest. Be sure to keep the conversation going on social media with #PrincetonForward. And visit forwardthinking.princeton.edu to access more content, including a downloadable resource guide that will help you dive deeper into the interdisciplinary world of data science and artificial intelligence. Until next time, keep up the forward thinking.